All right, guys, we'll go ahead and get started. We are officially finished with part one within the CCNA 200-301 official cert guide library volume one book. All right, we're finished with part one, which was an introduction to networking. Now we are moving on to part two. Part two being implementing Ethernet LANs, which stands for local area networks. Okay, so we're going to jump in. This is where the fun begins. So, very important piece. I believe this section involved four chapters. This piece is very important because it gives you a lot of foundation of, you know, connecting local area networks, connecting your host local area networks, you going on the journey of becoming that administrator that's going to be administrating these, your Cisco devices, right? So we'll be going over some of that. Um, I encourage you guys, of course, to start reading this section. Will encourage you to begin opening up Packet Tracer, or if you have a physical switch, to begin labbing. Very heavy because this will be very important pieces. Um, as you guys know, I'm going to be very technical because, of course, in the real world, they expect you to be technical as well. So let's go ahead and jump on in. Guys, just as a reminder, because I know Yasin reached out and wanted to know which book we are following. We are following the CCNA 200-301 second edition. Um, you can either get them separately, volume one or volume two, or I went ahead and got the library, which of course the library comes with both books within it. Um, if you go ahead and go to ciscopress.com, they actually have a special where you can get the physical book and the ebook all for $95. So you can use this link, go there. If you need me to drop the link, I will. Matter of fact, I will drop the link after this. But let's go ahead and get started. So, chapter four, using the command line interface. This is very important. I'm going to make some key points too from the real world, from my experience of being a network engineer. Um, and I think this will help you guys, one, for your exam, but also two, um, whenever you guys start building out your labs or whatever at home to build some best practices. So in the real world, they become second nature. Okay, so chapter four is going to be covering the following exam topics, right? 2.0, network access, and more specifically, 2.8, describe network device management access, right? And a different type of management access is Telnet, SSH, HTTP, HTTPS, console, TACACS Plus, and Radius, and cloud managed device. Okay, so one quick thing I wanted to go ahead and make a big point, right, is that there are many different types of Cisco switches. We have the Cisco Cat 9K switches. We have the Cisco Nexus 9K switches. We have also, which I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard of, the Cisco Meraki switches. They all have different uses, right? And of course, within this book, that they only touch on more specifically just the Cisco Catalyst switches. Okay, so just remember that. This is a great section. That's why I wanted to go ahead and get a screenshot. It details the different types of uses for the switches. So, and I'll just go ahead and read it, right? The Cisco Catalyst switches, they serve as a typical enterprise switches for use throughout an enterprise, right? The Cisco Nexus switches, right, which Cisco designs for use in data centers, in comparison to the CAT switches, right? Nexus switches support faster ports and more high-speed ports on a single switch, plus other features are optimized for data centers. A couple of data centers I've worked at, guys, we do use the Nexus 9Ks. So this is absolutely correct. Cisco Press is not blowing smoke to you. They actually support, um, faster speeds like 10 gig, 25 gig, right? Those higher data rates. Okay. Cisco Meraki switches, of course, they're built for enterprises. They meet a need. This is the most very important piece that you guys, being future engineers, need to understand. right? Whenever you're designing a network, whenever you're purchasing hardware, you always want to plan for meeting a need for the present and for the future. Okay. So that term you guys will hear a lot whenever you're speaking to the BU, the business unit. They'll probably ask you, you know, hey, we're okay with allocating money, but what need will be met you purchasing these devices or this license, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So back to the definition of Meraki switches. They're built for enterprises, similar to the CAT switches, but they meet a need for LAN switches and other network devices that use a simple cloud-based managed portal that provides easy onboarding of new devices. Okay, throughout throughout history, of course, whenever even back when the CCNA was the ICND one, that's when I took it. You know, the CCNA exam, it mentions switches. It is mainly referring to cat switches. It is not referring to Nexus. It's not referring to Meraki. And what that means is all the verification commands, all the commands that you'll probably put in, they will not reflect some of the commands and verification that you see within the Nexus OS or the Meraki OS. Okay, so just keep that in mind, guys. All right, but it will give you good foundation. All right, so let's go ahead and jump in. So this, of course, is a cat switch, right? This is the 9200L to be more specific. This is typically how it looks. We have our ports, depending on if you have the 24 port, 16 port, or the 48 port, right? You're going to have your console port. Now, a lot on the newer switches, we have a USB Mini Dash B console port. We also have a USB Type A flash, right? That's for, of course, the option to go ahead and upload OS, to go ahead and save configuration files. We'll get to configuration files a little bit later, right? And of course, for the ports, we have 100, we have 10, 100, and 1,000 gigabit ports. Okay. We have modular SFP plus ports, right? So 1 gig, 10 gig, right? Whenever you see that plus, that means that 10 gig is supported, right? But it is modular, right? So this is what you will see on most common Catalyst switches. Okay. All right. This table is very important, and I love this. It's not a key topic for the exam, but it goes over, the common name and of course the abbreviations. This is going to help you, of course, whenever you're in the command line and you're trying to get into the different configuration modes, right? And we go over that, right? So you have interface configuration mode, right? And with interface configuration mode, it's pretty easier to go ahead and abbreviate, right, some of the interfaces versus you guys typing the whole thing out, right? So this table, LAN switch interface ID examples with abbreviations, right? They go over a few things. And of course, what I love about this table, it talks about some things for the future, right? So speed supported, 10 megabits per second. The common name, as you guys learned in previous chapters, is Ethernet. Okay, 10 megabits per second. It refers to Ethernet, right? Um, of course, if we were looking within a switch that only supported, or a network device that supported 10 megabit per second interfaces, you'll see the interface would say Ethernet 0/0. Um, Quick Easter egg, right? If you were consoled into or um, using a virtual terminal to log into a Nexus switch, all the ports, even though they support 10 gigabits, right? Not 10 megabits, 10 gigabits, their ports are going to be um, they're going to have the interface ID of Ethernet, right? It's a quick little Easter egg, right? But the abbreviations, right? The valid abbreviations for Ethernet port will be E0/0, ET 0/0, ETH 0/0. So what do these abbreviations mean, right? So if you get into, right, a command prompt, you don't have to type Ethernet, fast Ethernet, gigabit Ethernet, 10 gigabit, et cetera, et cetera. If you know, right, and you can of course verify this, using a couple of show commands we'll talk about in the future. If you know either if it's Ethernet, fast Ethernet, gigabit, gigabit, that this abbreviation column, you know, hey, if I'm trying to get into configuration mode for this interface or specific interfaces, plural, you only have to go ahead and type the abbreviation. You do not have to type out the whole thing, right? So just keep that in mind. Let's go to the next row, right? 10 to 100 megabits per second, right? The common name for it is 10/100. The interface ID would be fast Ethernet. Okay. Of course, the abbreviation is F0/1, or it can be FA0/1. Okay. You'll see that a lot within Packet Tracer because I believe Packet Tracer uses a lot of fast Ethernet ports. I believe some switches have gigabit Ethernet ports. Okay. Okay. Let's keep going. Right. The 10, the speed supported for the 10, 100, and 1,000 megabits per second. Um, right? That is a gigabit Ethernet port, right? Of course, the abbreviation is G, or it can be GI, right? Now, this is where, of course, before I started explaining this table, where it's prepping you for the future, right? There are switches that have speed supported of 1 gig. That same port is going to support 2.5 gigabits, 5 gigabits, and 10 gigabits for a copper connection. Okay. The common name for that, as you guys probably guessed it, is multi-gig. Okay. Um, of course, an example switch ID for it is sometimes maybe 10 gig or T, or TE, right? The reason why this preps you for the future, right? Whenever you guys um become a part of an infrastructure team and you guys are designing maybe for um wireless, right? That's the key thing here. Wireless is becoming more compatible with higher speeds. Okay. So with that, you want to go ahead and plan, hey, Wi-Fi 7 is coming down the pipeline. It can support 2.5 gigs over the air or 5 gigs over the air. I can go ahead and connect my Ethernet port to my my multi-gig port to my wireless access point, and to be able to support higher speeds versus what we've been used to, where it's just supporting a 1 gig connection or 1,000 megabits per second connection. So if you're ever planning for switches, be sure to strive to obtain a multi-gig switch. But of course, do your site surveys. If you have some devices that only support 100 megabits per second devices, be sure that you go ahead and plan to get a switch for that. Okay. All right. Let's keep going. Right. The different type of operating systems for the Catalyst switches, it first started out as Cat OS. Right. So a lot of the old guys, a lot of the old network engineers, you'll hear them talk about Cat OS and say, oh, it's the same. Which technically it is, right? To be fair. There's just been upgrades over time, right? So between 1990 till about on the brink of 2010, Cat OS was used, right? Um, but of course, there was a migration starting within 2001, 2002, where Cisco wanted to implement the idea of iOS. Okay. Um, and as you can see within that, moving to iOS, they began creating enterprise class routers and switches, right? So use the same command line, right? But it was much easier to go ahead and manage, right, these devices. Um, then of course, in the middle of 2010, in the 2000s, right, it looks like here, right, my notes I have, it started within 2006. Cisco started to begin implementing within their switches iOS XE, right? Um, it modernized a lot of the architecture, right, within managing a switch, right? One of the key things that comes with iOS XE is that it improves the ability to go ahead and maintain a device, so software upgrades and what have you, without having to reboot the switch. That's big. right? So that helps, meet SLAs that you probably have with your customers or with your end users, right? It eliminates a lot of the downtime, right? So, um, much improvement over time. For the exam, for the CCNA, they are going to go ahead and refer to either iOS, right? Um, as well as iOS XE. So, um, when I said upgrade earlier, it means it's a continuation of it. So just be open. Make sure you have this book. You will be learning about iOS and iOS XE. Okay? All right. So how can we access the CLI? Right? So a couple of ways, right? This diagram you guys probably see, right? Get my good pencil, right? We have a connection from the PC directly to the switch. That connection is called a console connection, right? Using a console cable, right? The different types of console cables we have, a serial or a USB cable to a RJ45 or a USB. So it can be one of the two, one of the three, one of the four options, right? Or we have other ways. We can go ahead and use, right, um, an application protocol, right, via the TCP/IP stack, right, or the OSI model, right, to where we can go ahead and access it, right, virtually. Okay, that'll give us a virtual terminal, right? The two protocols would be Telnet and SSH. Okay, all right. So let's go ahead, let's erase all this, and let's keep going, right? So what is console access, right? So to give you guys a definition, right? Access is a physical connection between the PC and the switch's console port. Okay. So there's actually a port that says console on the switch that your physical PC would connect to. That is a console connection. Okay. Right. In contrast, what is that? What is that? What is that other connection, right? The Telnet and the SSH connection, right? Now this requires software, right? So you would use a virtual terminal software or terminal software, whether that be PuTTY, whether that be maybe a terminal application, right? Um, I personally use I have one. It's an RDP application that I use, but it comes SSH comes built in. I share it with you guys after this. I can't really remember the name right now. But what happens is it relies on a TCP IP network, right, to go ahead and communicate with the device. So there has to be a network connection via layer three. Okay. And of course, the TCP/IP stack is used to transmit that data back and forth between the switches, which means, of course, the switch would need an IP address, and of course, the host, your PC, would also need an IP address as well. Okay, let's keep going. All right. So this is how, of course, some of the console connection looks like. Right. We have the RJ45. All right. Good old modernized old school cable that goes into the switch. And of course, a lot of the older connections are a rollover cable. So serial to serial, which of course that goes to a serial port on the PC. This is very old, not very much used anymore, but it's still out there. You can still get it off Amazon, but very, very old. Now, of course, in the most recent 10 years, of course, we had a rollover cable. 15 years, I apologize. We have a rollover cable, of course, RJ45. It converts, right? And then to a USB cable to a USB port on your PC. Okay. Now, right, even with not just switches, with firewalls and anything that has a console port, it will have a USB port on the network device. So you make a USB connection from your PC on your USB port to the USB console port on the switch. Right. So this is the different types of console connections you can have. You guys being network engineers, of course, us moving to the future. I would recommend, of course, grabbing the last two of this diagram if you can, right? If you have the budget to, go ahead and grab it. Very cool. Nothing wrong with going ahead and if you guys are building a lab and have um, maybe have older switches, maybe the Cat 3Ks or the 2Ks, go ahead and grab the older rollover cable just to see if you guys are interested in that. But moving forward to the future, it's going to be a USB connection. Okay. All right. And typically, right, within a lot of these switches, right, this is an example, this is the Cat 9K, the 9200 to be exact, it is going to have, um, some of them are going to have that still the RJ45 console port, right, in the back of it. Of course, in the front of it, you'll see the mini USB console port, but of course, it'll still always still have that RJ45 in the back of it. Okay. And you guys are probably wondering, okay, we talked about consoles so much. How would we go ahead and reach out to the switch via using a TCP/IP stack? Well, first, you're going to have your terminal emulator. That needs to be whatever application that you use, right? The emulator. Um, there's 5 settings that needs to be set on the emulator to go ahead before you even type in the IP address and you press the button connect on that application, right? Now, these are the 5 settings. You need to know this for the exam. You will be asked about it, right? Those settings need to be, okay? If you are making a console connection, okay? This is just for a console connection. Um, if we're using um, if we're using PuTTY, we're going to go ahead and put 9600 bits per second. I believe PuTTY has a section for that. No hardware flow control, right? 8-bit ASCII, right? No parity bits and 1 stop bit. Okay, take a screenshot if you need to. These are the settings if you want to use a console connection using a terminal emulator. Okay, now it depends on the cable, and of course the book doesn't say this. It depends on the cable, right? But using an it also depends on the switch as well. Okay, let me not leave that out. Depending on the switch and the cable, these default settings should work. If they do not, and I've seen it more with the USB cables, you will have to change the baud rate um, being the reference of 9600, right? You would have to change it to 115/200. Everything else the same, but the baud rate would be 115/200. I can't explain why that's the case. I'm actually interested to go ahead and find out why so I can share it with you guys. Okay. And here's how typically a terminal emulator looks. This screenshot, of course, is from Mac OS. And this is how you would set this up. Now, this is a serial connection. This is not using the TCP IP stack, so there's no IP address or what have you. Okay. All right. Um, I want to go ahead and show you guys how it looks if we were to use terminal connection. Can you guys see my screen? Right. So if I were to go ahead, right, and use a terminal emulator using PuTTY, for example, and connect via a TCP IP connection, right? So a network connection, I would go ahead and type in the network address here. Okay. And go ahead and have the port number. And of course, the connection type could be SSH, or I can set it as other and change, right? Change the protocol that I'll be using. Of course, it's not so much more important about the application, but more so how you can access the CLI. Okay, right? In chapter 6, we'll be talking more about basic switch management. So it's going to cover more on configuring your switch to go ahead and support Telnet and SSH. Okay, all right. Let's go ahead and keep going. All right. So whenever you log in, right, we go ahead and log into your device. There's a couple of modes that, and I'm sure DeMarco, you heard me say these different modes. And a couple of you guys have heard me say these modes whenever we are talking about the FortiGate or anything, right? There are three CLI access modes. All right. I'm sorry, there are three CLI access methods that are covered, right? Um, depending on, depending on the way that you access the switch, either way, you will always be placed in the same mode, right? And that mode is user exec mode. Okay. Or you can just call it user mode, right? What is this mode used for, right? By definition, right? To keep it very simple at a high level, user mode allows the user to look around, but to not break anything. So you can run a couple of verification commands, a couple of show commands, but you cannot make configuration changes. Okay. All right. The next mode that we have, right, is called privilege mode. Some people call it enable mode, right? Because the term enabled is used, right? But enable mode, right, it is used to go ahead and start putting in, a little bit more commands that have a little bit more quote unquote power, right? And of course, you can go ahead and access configuration mode, which of course changes the configuration of the device, right? Um, one big command that you have access to within privilege mode is the reload command, right? That reinitialize and reboots the switch. So very, very, very important. Um, so let's go ahead and erase this, right? Um, before I hop off this diagram, right? That command, when you're in user mode, you want to go ahead and reach privilege mode. I want to make sure I make that a point. You type the word enable, right? And we'll talk about AAA and we'll talk about um, access and authorization per user in the future and how to secure your switch, right? But by default, without a configuration, if you use three different methods to access the CLI, you're automatically brought into user mode. If you want to get to privilege mode, you type the word enable. If you want to leave privilege mode, you type the word disable. And it will take you out of privilege mode and bring you back to user mode. Okay, let's keep going. And of course, we'll have a lab that goes through all this. One quick note before we hop off of this diagram is I wanted to make sure I capture this, right? Okay, if the command prompt ends with a call me a kid, the alligator facing to the left, right? You are in user mode. Okay. If the command prompt ends with a number sign, the user is in enable mode. Those are the difference, and you need to know that for the exam. It doesn't say key topic, but it is key topic as I explained it to you. You have to understand the difference, okay? All right, good stuff. Let's go ahead and keep going. All right. So here's an example of the note that I just shared, right? So, right, alligator facing to the left, that's telling us we're in user mode, right? This screenshot is showing us that somebody just, went ahead and used three different methods to get us to the switch. They put in the password, and of course, now we're in user mode, right? In user mode, like you guys saw, you can't reload the switch. So, right, so this verifies that you have limited commands, limited access to the switch and what you can do. Okay. You are just a user, you are just able to view. Now, if we wanted to go ahead and get privilege, access, right? We need to go ahead and go to privilege mode. So we type the word enable, right? In a highly secure environment, you are going to have an enable secret, right? So a password to get into privilege mode, right? So that's what you guys see here. Of course, that password that you type in is masked, right? This is not just for the screenshot. It's not omitted. So then once you type in the right password, the switch is going to go ahead and look within its hash and say, hey, this hash matches what we have stored into the control plane. I'll go ahead and give you access. Now, let's go ahead and erase this drawing. Now that you see, right, exactly what we just spoke about via that note, the symbol changes now to the number sign. right? And now if I wanted to run that reload command, it now works, right? It asks me to confirm. And of course, the syslog message pops up and says, hey, syslog message level 5, reload or reload request by console, reload reason, reload command. Okay. And we'll talk about the different log levels later in the future. But that's how it looks like. Okay. Now, you guys heard me speak about, um, a little bit of security and securing the switch or what have you. Um, by default, right? Cisco switches out of the box are meant to be racked and stacked and ready to go, right? But as the network administrator, you being that CCNA, you need to secure your switch, right? So the little bit of passive security you want to go ahead and implement within your CLI, right? Accessing your CLI, what have you. So as you guys can see here, I'll go ahead and grab my handy dandy red pencil, right? As I explained, you have that enable secret, okay, right? But also, right, what we have here is a password, right? This password references how to go ahead and access the console, right? Right? We'll talk more within chapter 6 that goes over basic switch management. But we have a password, we have an enable secret, right? These are some of the commands that you put in before you go ahead and fully implement the switch within your environment to provide some password security for your CLI access. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and break this down because I feel like nerding out this morning. All right. So let's look at this first line, right? Line console 0, right? This defines the console port, right? Any type of console access that you're doing, this is what defines what that access can do, right? So what and keep it simple, guys, when you're reading a lot of these, when you're reading the configuration, what have you. So if I look at line console, it's saying, hey, these next commands that are indented after this, right, apply only to the console. They don't apply to the entire switch, right? So if I look at login, right, login is telling me, right, perform a simple password check at the console, not the entire switch, just at the console. Okay. By default, the switch doesn't ask for passwords for console users, right? It assumes that you have this in a highly secured environment within a IDF or MDF, and that only privileged members, right, privileged administrators are able to access this. Okay, but of course, nothing is absolute in this world. So, to provide higher security, you want to go ahead and add. These are options. I'm sorry, let me not, make an absolute wording for Cisco. Here is an option that Cisco is giving you to secure your device, right? So log in, of course, that password faith. Whenever somebody logs into the console, that password, the password faith would need to be provided before they can go ahead and get to user mode. Okay. So this is what a simple configuration looks like. Now, once that person gets into the switch, right, and wants to go to privilege exec mode, they're going to have to add a enable password based on this configuration. And we had, of course, our password being love, right? And this was configured by using the enable secret command. Okay, we'll talk more about that in the future. All right. I just want you guys to remember that moving forward. Okay. Now there are other ways, right, to access the command line, right, and to access the switch, right? So these newer switches, and of course, like I said, this book is referencing a lot of the cat switches within the time of this writing. Currently, Cisco has the Cat 9Ks in production and circulation. Okay, so a lot of the Cat 9K switches, they have a web UI, so a web user interface. Um, okay, so and of course, a lot of these newer switches have iOS XE. Okay, this is how it looks like. You assign an IP address to the switch, right, out of the box. Once you have that configured, you enable HTTP, HTTPS, right? We strive for HTTPS, right, for more security. You are able to then look at the dashboard, right? And of course, the dashboard of the switch, which is built in, you're able to monitor, right? The switch, you can add some configuration, add some, do some administration, some basic management stuff, right? You also can take a look at licensing, very important stuff, because now, of course, Cisco devices, they depending on what device that you have, if you don't have the proper license, you will not be able to perform certain functions. So we spoke about last chapter, chapter 3, which is routing protocols. Some switches, if you don't have the proper license, you won't be able to use routing protocols. Okay. So, very important stuff. And of course, it comes with a little bit of troubleshooting tools. Not much, right? But it makes our lives a little bit easier. Okay. All right. But how do we use the web UI to go ahead and access the CLI, right? So, and I've actually tried this in uh, my environment, my work environment, right? You can, right, go ahead and access the web UI, go to configuration, and you guys are going to freak out, right? Go to this section, right, that you may want to go ahead and configure, and you can make the web UI configuration changes. And of course, as you guys can see here, you can't see it, and I'll try to show you guys. Um, I'll try to show you guys whenever we have our lab session on Thursday. You can make those web UI changes, right? But within the administration section, let's go ahead and erase this. And I think I have the section on the other slide. You can actually directly from the web UI add these configurations from the web UI. So you'll have CLI access from the website. Okay. So you would put in the commands here, right? And then you'll go ahead and actually do this. You can actually type run command. And what'll happen is once you run the command, what'll happen is this command would show down here and the output would be down here and you would see it. Right? Very cool stuff. Um, and the thing is, let me clear some of this drawing, right? You can type an entire command, right? Or you can type the command, get your output. You can copy this output, like it literally to your notepad and drop it there. Or you can just export your entire session that you have within the CLI web UI session and export it to a notepad, right? Or a text application. Very cool stuff. You know, I like to go ahead and configure these switches with web UI access just as a backup. I'm old school. I like the CLI, but just in case I can't get into the CLI for some odd reason, um, the web UI has saved me a lot. Chapter 22 of this book, of volume two, is going to go over is going to go ahead and go over Cisco SD access, um, which of course touch on web UI per device, and of course a little bit more things that you can do within the web UI. Okay, let's keep going. Now, this is my favorite section. Um, I think I've told you guys, especially more recently, DeMarco, um, how important the help command is. Um, you may be reading a lot of your documentation. You may be seeing a lot of maybe your coworkers, your network engineers that you probably work with, network administrators. They're able to type commands so fast, right? That came with time. And I say that in past tense because everybody is not an expert in the beginning, right? Um, Cisco, of course, on their website, they have something called Cisco iOS command reference, right? And it'll show you a whole bunch of commands, right? But even when you speak to the authors of this book, the editors, what have you. These are former network engineers or current network engineers, right? They will tell you that nobody in this world should be expected to memorize all the commands within a switch. Admirable, but no one memorizes all the commands on a switch, right? There's a couple of commands that you'll use that are convenient. They're tools. They help you verify a few things, right? And of course, you following this Cisco certification track, right? You'll become, you'll become more. It'll become second nature to remember a lot of the commands. But I want you guys to make a point that to put in your mind that you will not remember everything, and it is perfectly fine to put in the help command. That help command is the question mark. So while you're in a CLI, maybe you don't know something. Maybe in your head you're like, shoot, I'm trying to do a verification for spanning tree, but maybe I don't know what I want. Perfect. It's time for you to be an engineer, right? This help command, right? The question mark will give you options, right? And the thing I like about Cisco and of course different vendors, they'll give you an explanation of the commands that that you have access to and what the possible options, right? So let's go through this table and I'll speak about and I could do more breakdown and a better explanation come Thursday whenever we have this lab, right? Because this is a very special section for me, right? So Cisco iOS software command help. And if I can hear somebody's background, may need to mute. Um, One second. So what do you enter, right? If you are in the CLI and you enter a question mark, right? What help do you get? This option provides help for all commands in the available mode. Let's say excellent, right? Okay, I see the available options, right? But what's next, right? You can type in the command if we're looking at the next row, right? We type in the command, but then you could type in a question mark after that because you want to know what's after that. With a space between the command and the question mark, the switch lists text to describe all the first parameter options for the command. Okay. All right. Now let's say you guys are labbing and you guys are probably like, I think I know what this command is, but I don't remember, or I don't know if it's available on this iOS. You can put in partial the command. So maybe if we're talking about spanning tree, maybe you could put in SPA and then a question mark, right? To not even finish the word spanning, but just put question mark. This option lists the commands that start with the command that you're putting. Okay. All right. What else can we do, right? We have command space perimeter, right? What does this mean, right? This option lists all the perimeters beginning with the perimeter type so far, okay? And keep in point, there's no space between perimeter and the question mark, right? So let's go ahead and let's say we're in privilege exec mode and we're trying to configure a good example that I can think of quick and easy is the clock, right? And you type in clock, and I believe right after that, if my memory serves me, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, it'll say type in the date, right? And right after you type in the month, you could put in the question, you could put in the month, you could type in the year, and if you put the question mark, it'll give you different parameters, right? For the time, of course, the hour, the minutes, and the seconds. Okay, so this is what that does, right? So question mark can help out so much, right? The command arm tab. Okay. I'm going to go over this on Thursday too, but I love the tab command, right? Pressing the tab key, right, causes that iOS to spell out the rest of a word, assuming that you have typed enough of the word so it's not ambiguous, okay, to the switch, right? So that there is only one option that begins with that string of characters. Okay. And I'm so excited right now because I want to show you guys what this looks like in the lab, but I know we're doing theory now, so I'm not going to go too far ahead. Okay. But Command Palm tab. You also can use the tab function to go ahead and spell out the words. So you're not, trying to spell out something. So far we were talking about the different type of interfaces. So 10 gigabit, fast Ethernet, what have you. Maybe you don't want to shorten it or abbreviate it. You can type in TE and hit tab, and it will finish if you've made it as less ambiguous as possible, right? If you hit tab, it'll finish the rest of the characters for you within that command. Okay. And of course, last but not least, Command Palm 1. And of course, you guys put in the question mark, it'll list you the second part of parameters, right? Going back to that clock command and give you a brief explanation. Okay. All right. I know I've been speaking a lot for a while. Any questions so far? All you guys are muted, by the way, but feel free to ask me a question.
Um, Thank you, Dave. I do kind of have kept one question um, in terms of comparing SSH and the console access.
Mhm.
When we log into a switch using SSH, any of the TCP/IP stack,
Mhm.
um, does it take us directly into the privilege exec command prompt, or does it take us to the user mode?
That's a good question. That is a great question. So let's go back to the diagram, right? So auto has by default, we're not using any type of, you know, um, custom configuration using AAA. If you just enable SSH or Telnet, all right, or using console, it's going to bring you directly into user mode. It's right. It's not going to skip that process and bring you straight to privilege mode. You have to first get to user mode, okay?
Okay.
And then to get to privilege mode, you type in the enable command, and then you're in privilege mode. Okay.
Yeah, I understand that. So must be a custom configuration that takes you right into the
And when I
privilege.
and when I say custom, right, I mean with AAA, right?
Okay.
There's configuration within AAA that says, hey, using Radius, right? If I go ahead and check my network policy server, my NPS within, if we're using a Windows server, okay, make sure I make that clear. You can have configuration set to where these users within that meet these conditions for a group, you as soon as you telnet, right, or you telnet or you SSH into or you console into a switch, if AAA is being used, you will bypass user mode and it'll bring you directly into privilege mode. You can configure that using AAA.
Understood.
Okay,
Thank you.
good questions. Anybody else? Okay, all right. Um, guys, I want to go ahead and make a point. Um, I'm going to bring up the book, and I missed a key point here. Let's do that. So one of the guys, let me know if you can see this. I'm still sharing my screen.
Yes.
One of the things, whenever you're navigating through a switch, right, is navigating through your history, and of course, navigating through putting in commands, right? So let's talk about the key sequences for command edit and recall, right? So the keyboard, and we'll go through the different rows, right? This table goes over the keyboard command and what happens, right? So using the up arrow or control P, right? What happens? This keyboard command displays the most recently used command. If you press it again, the next most recent command appears until the history buffer is exhausted, right? And what does the P stand for whenever using control P? It stands for previous. Okay. Let's talk about the keystroke for the data error or control N. If you've gone too far back into the history buffer, these keys take you forward to the more recently entered commands. The N stands for next. Okay. The left arrow or control B, right? This keyboard command moves the cursor backward in the currently displayed command without deleting characters, right? So maybe you mistyped whenever you were trying to do a verification of spanning tree. So you said show spanning, but maybe you put in a V instead of an A within spanning. You can do the left arrow or control B until you are at the character that you want to delete. You press backspace, put in the right character, you're good to go. Okay. The right arrow is the opposite of the left arrow, right? Or you can use Control F, right? And it just takes you forward, right? And of course, the F stands for forward. Okay. And Control B and Control F is going to take you backward and forward within a command to edit it without deleting it. Just keep that in mind. Okay. Backspace, right? What this does, of course, it moves the cursor um, backwards, right? In some OSs, right? Um, Displaying, of course, the display command and deleting characters. It also makes spaces between different commands, but for Cisco iOS XE, this command, and for the exam, this command, this keyboard command moves the cursor backward in the currently displayed command, deleting characters. Okay? I want you guys to keep that in mind. All right, especially for the exam. All right, so let's get back. All right, so this next section goes over within the same chapter. It talks about the debug and the show commands. Some of my favorite, right? As you guys can see here, quick glimpse, right? The show command has a whole bunch of options. I mean, Jesus, I love that command. It'll show you the operational status of different functions within the switch, right? And we talked about the three basic functions, the three major functions of a switch in the past, right? One of the functions is for the switch to learn MAC addresses, right? And to forward frames, right? Forward frames based on the MAC addresses, right? One of the things that need to be built within the switch to be able to do that is a MAC address table, right? We're not going to go deep into what a MAC address table is. This is just a show command example of the MAC address table. Okay. All right. Um, Now, there are debug commands. I'd rather show you guys that within a lab. The book doesn't have good examples, but this is an example of a show command. Okay. With, of course, a debug command, you would also need to go ahead and configure um, what debug you would like to see, and then enable the debugs to be shown within your terminal. Okay. So let's go ahead and move on. All right. Let's talk about configuring the switch, right? Configuring the iOS software as the switch says so, right? You guys see this before, right? But we have a little bit more added on, right? We spoke about accessing the switch, whichever method that we use, the three methods, right? And getting to between user mode and to privilege exec mode or enable mode, as they call it, right? But if we want to make configuration changes, we have to go to a mode to make those configuration changes. That mode is called configuration mode, right? And to access that, we would type in the command configuration, configure terminal, right? Or config T. Okay. All right. And of course, to go ahead and exit configuration terminal, right? Or configuration mode, you go ahead and have to put in the word end or control Z or exit. That works as well. That would go ahead and bring us to privilege exec mode. If we want to go all the way back down to user mode, we can go ahead and type in the word disable or type the word exit. That will bring us to privilege to user mode. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and go a little bit deeper and talk about this. Right. So a lot of things here, right? A couple of things within configuration mode that you can do is moving between the sub modes, right? And the context settings command. So what does that mean, right? Movement from enable mode to global configuration mode is done by configure terminal. That brings us to configuration mode, right? So let's talk about the context, right? Context setting means there are specific commands that we can only do within the context of configuration terminal. There are specific commands that we can put in within the context of privilege exec mode. There are specific commands that we can put in within the context of user exec mode. I hope you guys are understanding where I'm going with when I talk about context setting commands. Okay. So if we get into configuration terminal mode, there are different commands that are called, of course, context setting commands that you can put in that are not available to you within specific prompts. So what do I mean by that? The context setting command for the basic configure terminal, right? If I put in the host name, if I say host name Fred within global configuration mode to configure the switch's name, that's going to configure the name of the switch. But let's say I say, hey, DeMarco, I want you to go ahead and configure a password on the console whenever somebody tries to log in. He needs to move from global configuration mode to console line configuration mode. Now the context changes, right? So now the commands that he can put in is a small set of context setting commands, right? That he can put in that is not available in other modes, that is only available within the mode that he's in. And we call those sub modes, right? So we're in global config mode. One of the sub modes is line configuration mode, right? So I can't configure the host name within the context setting mode of line configuration mode. Okay. Right. So if my Kiwi is trying to configure the host name of the switch, she can't go into line configuration mode and make that change because the context is different. Okay. All right. Any questions?
Yeah, hey Dave. So when you go into console line console,
Hmm.
um when you go into that mode, that's is that mode only like configuring the password, or is it more configurations in that mode?
Good question. Good question. So I don't want you to harp on what you can do within that mode, right? You're gonna learn that. You're gonna learn that over time reading the book. The key thing I'm trying to, is to communicate to you guys, right? Is that there are different commands that are available to you depending on the context of the mode that you're in. Okay.
Yep, got you.
So I'm not going to answer that question that you asked. That's more so very specific that I know you're going to learn on your journey, and I don't want you guys to harp on that because now you're basing your learning off of memory. I want you to base it learning off of the theory that you are learning.
Got you.
Okay.
Got
Okay.
you. Yep.
All right. So let's keep going. I'm
All
not
right.
going to go through this whole. I'm not going to read this whole list. You guys can read. Oopsies. Made a mistake. Hold on. All right. Can you guys see?
Yeah, I can see.
Yes.
All right. I blame Gary for me stop sharing. It's all your fault, Gary. All right. Let's keep going. Um, And of course, this is an example, as you guys can see, navigating through the different configuration modes, right, in a different context, right? So we do config terminal. Of course, we can shorten it for config T. We can put in the host name here within just global config mode, right? But as you can see, right, and you'll see this within the lab on Thursday, let's say we go to line configuration mode, right? Right? Now the switch defines, hey, config line. Now it's telling us that the context has changed for the configuration mode that we're in, right? So it tells us, hey, you're in config line, right? But what if we want to go ahead and configure go into a different context? within configuration. Maybe we want to go into an actual interface. So Don says, hey, I want to go ahead and go to fast Ethernet 0/1. You can do that. And now it's going to tell Don, hey, Don, you're actually in an interface. So it'll be shown as config-if, right? Then when Don is done, Don can go ahead and just exit and say, hey, I type in exit. Exit would bring him one level down. So he'll still be in global configuration mode. He just won't exit global configuration mode in general, right? And bring him back down to, it won't bring him back down fully to privilege exec mode, right? As I was telling you guys earlier, if you type the word end within global configuration mode, it'll bring you here. But if you use the word exit, it'll just bring you one level down. And you guys are probably thinking, what if I use exit whenever I'm in just the base global configuration mode? It'll bring you to privilege exec mode because the term exit within using it within global configuration mode, it brings you one level down. Using end, let's say we used end right here. No matter what context, what configuration mode he's in within global configuration, it is going to bring you out of global configuration and bring you straight to user exec mode. Okay, let's keep going. Here's a table, of course, explaining the different types of configuration modes, right? So if we see here, this config with the number sign, we are in global config mode. So if you guys hear me say, hey, we're in global config mode, or you guys are in global config mode, that's what that means, right? So the context setting commands, none, first mode after global config. So as soon as you type in global config within privilege exec mode, this is what you're in, okay? Config dash line, right? What does this tell us? This tells us we're in line configuration mode, okay? There's different types of lines, right? So we have line console, we have line VTY, right? Line console, of course, is for your console port. Line VTY is for your virtual, right? Your virtual terminal sessions. Each switch, each network device are allocated a number of sessions, right? These sessions are defined with these numbers. So for this, right, lines 0 through 15, there's 16 sessions that can be used at one time. Okay. But line VTY refers to virtual terminal sessions. So trying to connect to the switch using an application protocol, whether that be SSH or terminal. Okay. All right. Interface configuration mode. Of course, the prompt would show config IF. The name of the mode is interface configuration. Of course, how to get there will be interface, the type of interface. So either it be gigabit, fast Ethernet, 10 gigabit, right? And then the number of the interface. If you don't know what the number of the interface, there are always show commands that you guys can use to go ahead and learn about. Okay. And then, of course, VLAN configuration. Okay. This is not to get mistaken for configuring a layer 3 interface for a VLAN. That will still be interface configuration mode. It'll just be for a VLAN. Okay. VLAN configuration mode is a totally different thing. That is for layer 2. Okay. So whenever you see config VLAN, this is for layer 2. All right. Okay. Let's keep going. Okay. So we spoke about this, right? I think I gave you guys a good breakdown. You can take a screenshot, right? We go from enable mode to global configuration mode. We have the different types of modes. We have interface, we have VLAN, right? And of course, we reach that using VLAN and the VLAN number. We got line console mode, and we have line VTY mode, okay? And of course, to leave out of all of those, if we're within the configuration mode, we could type the word end, and it'll bring us back to privilege exec mode, okay? All right, let's keep going. You guys are probably wondering, what are we looking at here? All right. So within all the configuration that we do, right, and all the changes that we make, the switch needs to store configuration files, right? It needs to use some type of configuration, right? And and the key thing here is that if we make all these configurations, so let's say it's a team of Donovan, uh, DeMarco, Gary, Mykevia, and me, right? We need to have a way of, if we all are configuring the switch needs to have a way to retain the configuration in case it loses power, right? Now, just like our PCs, right? The Cisco switches, right? They have different types of memory, right? Different types of memory within it, that'll help out or what have you, right? So let's talk about these different types of memory, right? So it has RAM, right? Sometimes called, if we want to get technical, DRAM, dynamic RAM, right? Um, Stands for dynamic random access memory, right? RAM is used by the switch just as it is, right? Just like our PCs at home, right? It's for working storage, storage that we are using while we are using the device, right? This is where the running config, right? Or the active config, this is where it will be stored, right? Unsaved, but this is where it will be stored. RAM is, and I'm sure if you guys ever took the CompTIA Plus, you guys probably learned RAM is volatile memory. What does that mean? If the device powers off, that memory is deleted. Understand that, okay? So let's talk about flash. Flash memory, right? It's a chip within it's a chip inside of the switch, right? Or it's an SD card, right? What it does, it goes ahead and stores the the firmware, right? The firmware of the switch or just images in general, right? Within a location within the Cisco iOS, right? Where the switch boots its image from. Okay. So within Flash, we need to make sure some type of image sits there, right? This is where it would boot the iOS from. So how our switch works, how it knows to go from the different modes that we talked about today, it needs to have the image there before we can do anything. We can do anything within the switch. Okay. Within flash memory, it also can store, other files. It can store the backup of configurations or what have you. So it can, flash is, you want to think about that like your hard drive. Okay. Um, Read-only memory, right? Or ROM, right? This stores a bootstrap or boot helper program that is loaded when the switch first powers on, right? This bootstrap program then finds the full Cisco iOS image. Okay. Put a little drawing for you guys, right? The ROM finds the iOS, the firmware, right? And manages the process of loading the iOS. So it grabs it and says, excellent. I'm going to go ahead and load this iOS into RAM, which at that point, right, the Cisco iOS would go ahead and take over the operation of the switch. What does that mean? What that means is the ROM comes in and says, hey guys, we booted up. We're going to go ahead and run post. Hey, where is the iOS? Oh, here's the iOS. The iOS is in Flash. Now I need to run the iOS within RAM so that our users can go ahead and integrate, interact with the switch, right? To go ahead and make configuration changes and what have you. I need to put it in RAM. I need to put it in RAM so that it can be working. Okay. That's how you want to go ahead and remember how this process works, right? Okay. Now, right, we talked about Flash having the Cisco iOS, the image. But what stores our configuration changes that we make? It is the NVRAM, right? Now we spoke about RAM being volatile. The NVRAM stands for non-volatile RAM. That's the difference. RAM, volatile, if it loses power, it loses memory. Non-volatile RAM, it does not, right? And what non-volatile RAM does is stores the initial or startup configuration file that is used when the switch is first powered on. Okay. All right. So whenever, right, if we're talking about the process, it goes ahead and boots up, the RAM is going to go ahead and check, hey, I'm going to look at the working memory. What does the working memory say? The startup configuration is right here. This is what I need to boot up. All this is going to be running temporarily while it's running. So I need to rely on everything else, right, to know what I need to be running while the switch is operational. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yes, it
Yes.
does.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Good.
Yeah,
Right.
makes sense.
Okay. So for the exam, right? Right. There are two different types of file names for configuration. We have the startup configuration, right? Stores the initial configuration used anytime the switch reloads the Cisco iOS. Okay. Where is it stored? It is stored within NVRAM, so non-volatile RAM. Need you to understand that for the exam. The running configuration stores the currently used configuration commands, right? Within RAM, right? This file changes dynamically when someone enters commands in configuration mode. So, what does that mean? If Gary and Mykevia are making changes to the switch, right? It's going to be stored in RAM. If they do not save the configuration, if the switch loses power, it will lose those configuration changes that Mykevia and Gary has made, unless they go ahead and save the configuration. Simple enough?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So let's talk about this real quick because I love this, right? Um, so if we're looking at here, right? So same example, Mykevia and Gary, right? Let's say, right, we go ahead and we're logged in, right? We're logged into the switch called Hannah, right? The running config, right? We do a show running config. The host name is Hannah, right? There's also a verification command that we can put in that's called show startup config. All right. Well, for the startup config that shows us what's in non-volatile RAM, it's showing us the host name is Hannah, right? So we can make the assumption that the running config and the startup config has the same configuration, right? Let's say the marker comes in, he goes into configuration terminal or config terminal, and he changes the host name to Harold. So he renames the switch. He exits. There's no save, right? DeMarco says, hey, I want to go ahead and verify my changes, right? He does the show running config command and he sees his change. He says, host name Harold. Excellent, right? But if he does a verification with the startup command, right, showing us our non-volatile memory, it still says the host name for what Gary and Mykevia configured because he did not save that configuration. So this is showing you how you would make a change to the running config file, but not the startup config file. Does this make sense?
Yep. So as long as you're making those changes while you actually active in the switch, if you don't save it and it boots back up, it's going to boot back into HANA.
It's going to boot back into what you have saved within the NVRAM. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So you have to be very careful, and this is me talking off the record. You have to be very careful whenever you are configuring a network device. Okay, especially working with multiple people. Make your changes before you jump into anywhere, and everybody knows my rule. You do a show start. You grab that. You do a show run. You grab that. Before you do any type of troubleshooting, I need all you guys to hear me and remember this. Before you do any type of troubleshooting, you do that. That will eliminate roughly 15 to 30 minutes of troubleshooting. I guarantee you. Because you need a baseline. You need to understand where to start from. And that will show you the entire configuration. Okay? You need to understand what's in the volatile memory in the RAM, and you need to understand what's in the non-volatile memory, the NVRAM. Okay? All right. Last but not least, I want you guys to lab. I want you guys to have fun. I want you guys to get in the packet tracer, play music loud as you can. Have your book out and just go ahead and just have fun, right? With the multiple labs that you're doing, you probably want to save your labs or what have you, or you get a pre-made lab done. I want you to understand, right? Whenever you're doing a lab, whenever you're administrator of a switch, right? You do, with great power comes great responsibility, right? Shout out to Spider-Man. Whenever you're creating that lab or you're managing a switch, there are 3 commands that you can do that for whatever reason you need to do it, you can delete the configuration out of the NVRAM, the non-volatile RAM. These 3 commands would go ahead and do. You have write erase, you have erase startup config, you have erase NVRAM. These are very powerful commands, right? Once you delete the startup config file, right, it'll go ahead and, and if you go ahead and reload the switch, right, power it off and on, whether it be you do that via layer 1 or by software, it'll boot up with a empty startup configuration. Okay. Now, there isn't a command to erase the running config because all you just have to do is just reload the switch and the running config will be gone because it's volatile memory. Every time it loses power, it's not going to save it. Okay. All right. To clear out the running config file, if you needed to, all right, you can go ahead and erase the startup config file and then reload the switch, and the running config will be empty at the end of its process. But I need you guys to understand, you have to know what you're doing, and this needs to be done with great care using any 3 of these commands. Because if you do it in the wrong context, you might as well start looking for another job. Make sense?
Yep.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Any questions? Any questions going once?
No, I don't have anything.
Not for me.
Yeah,
Everybody?
none for me either.
Okay. All right, guys. I'll go ahead and get this uploaded. You guys enjoy your Sunday.
Thank you.
Thank you,
All right,
Dave.
guys.